I never saw Bitcoin. And now I'm going, holy moly, what's going to happen next? So what do you think is going to happen next, Mr. Breedlove?
Yeah, no one saw Bitcoin coming. No one had any expectation that gold could be disrupted, or even have a competitor for that matter. So it's very interesting times we live in. But I think the US in 2021 is on equivalent monetary footing to France in 1791.
Okay.
And to put a few numbers to this, so after expanding, France had been expanding its money supply roughly 300% in the years leading up to 1791. They then settled into an annual expansion of 18% per year in 1792.
Okay.
I'm going to walk you through the history of France, and I'll tie it back to the US. So 1792, France is expanding 18% a year. They double their money supply expansion again to 35% in 1794. Again, the law of accelerating issuance and depreciation. The more money they printed, the more money they had to print to keep the thing going. Then in 1795, France quadrupled their money supply expansion rate to 145% per year. And finally, in 1796, the printing press, where they're actually creating the currency, the assignats, was publicly broken and burned so they could prove that they would not print anymore. And the currency had fallen to zero, basically. And so in that 6-year period, 1790 to 1796, France expanded its money supply 100x and fully depreciated its currency. So if we use that as kind of a framing, and that there's many historical examples, but I just picked one that conveys the law of accelerating issuance and depreciation to tie that to the US. In the US today, from 2001 to 2020, we've expanded our money supply roughly 250%. So just a little bit less than France did. And recently, in 2020, we've started expanding our money supply at about 18% per year. Now, that's a conservative estimate. The actual numbers are roughly 25%, but I'm just going to go with 18 to be conservative.
So we're tracking right on the numbers.
Tracking right on the numbers. And so if we again, looking at the law of accelerating issuance and depreciation, I would predict that by the year 2024, we will be forced to double that issuance rate again. So from 18% to 35%. And as you alluded to earlier, Biden is already talking about $5 and $10 trillion stimulus packages. That would be well in excess of 35% expansion. So I think that will happen again. And then by the year 2030, I would expect that we'd have to quadruple that rate again, reaching a monetary expansion rate in the US of 145% annually. By that time, so if those rates hold between now and 2030, where we increase to 35% in 2024 and 145% in 2030, the total US M2 money supply will have expanded from today, it's around 20 trillion. It will expand 25x to $500 trillion. That's what I think is going to happen in the next decade in the US money supply. And then if we look abroad, I think what you're going to have is just a wave of smaller currency collapses, smaller sovereigns with weaker currencies. They will just be collapsing stronger currencies like the dollar, like the Chinese yuan as well. And by the end of this decade, I would expect that the total purchasing power of the dollar globally today it represents about 20%. So global M2 is roughly 100 trillion. The dollar is about 20 trillion. So it represents 20% of global purchasing power. I think it will double. So as some of these currencies collapse, they collapse into the dollar. So by the end of the decade, the year 2030, I would expect the US to have about 40%, US dollar to have about 40% of global purchasing power. So if the dollar is at a $500 trillion market cap and it represents 40% of global M2, that means the global money supply has expanded to $1.25 quadrillion. That is $1,250 trillion, which is about 12x what it is today.
So that sounds like the derivatives market to me, which is a completely BS market. But we'll come back. The people love numbers and all this, but one of the reasons people want to listen to you right now is everybody wants to know, in 2031, what is your prediction for the price of Bitcoin. That is the only thing that people really care about right now. So they're going to make a decision whether they buy or not. Not on France, not on anything like this. But what does Robert Breedlove see the future, given if history tracks, which it seems to be tracking, what will the price of Bitcoin be in 2031, which is 10 years? We'll be right back. Welcome back, Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show. Good news and bad news about money. You can listen to the Rich Dad Radio program anytime, anywhere on iTunes or Android and YouTube. And then please leave a review whenever you listen. All of our programs are archived at richdadradio.com. We archive them because we're an education company. We make no recommendations. We're purely educational. Anything we say, take with a grain of salt. We don't recommend anything. And the most important thing is if you listen to this program again, you'll learn twice as much because repetition is how we learn. That's how you become a better golfer. Repeat, keep repeating. But also listen to this with friends, family, and business associates, especially those out there who are saving their stimulus check and hoping this will save them from what's coming down the road. Because our guest today is a friend of the Rich Dad Company, Rich Dad Radio, Robert Breedlove. And he's a founder and CEO and CIO of Parallax Digital. He's not only a CPA, but he's also an expert on this thing called Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. And he's talking about what's going to happen in the next 10 years with the US dollar, gold, silver, but most importantly, Bitcoin. So before we go on, Robert was talking about something about which is beyond my head, but we had our good friend, his name is Philip Haslam. He's from South Africa. He wrote the book, when currency destroys nations. And he was writing about the fall of Zimbabwe. And he's saying exactly the same thing Robert Breedlove is saying. He calls it the 7 falls. And the 7 falls is once a country like Zimbabwe starts to print money, you take the first jump and you can't go back up. Then you take the next jump and there's 4 more falls to go. And you keep jumping. And so that's what Robert Breedlove's talking about in this program here is America's already gone down that road. We took a big jump in 2021. This is March 2021, and we're going to keep jumping. So the question is, Mr. Breedlove, what do you see happening in the future? I mean, we have 2031 coming. And everybody was going to hold it till last, but what do you think the future price of Bitcoin might be in 2031? But keep going into your analysis of why we have to keep jumping.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's an old saying that says it's harder to stop halfway downhill than to just not go initially. And I think that's what inflation is. Yeah. And this law that we mentioned, this law of accelerating issuance and depreciation related to currency, this is an ancient law. I mean, it's been written about for hundreds and hundreds of years. This is not a joke. This is not something I made up. This is something you can find everywhere, that this pattern repeats. Once countries start down this path, it's very bad and it's inescapable. You can't turn back. So going into 2031, which as we left off earlier, I would expect the U.S. money supply to expand from 20 trillion-ish today to about 500 trillion in the next 10 years. I expect global M2 to expand roughly 12x from around 100 trillion to about 1,250 trillion, 1.25 quadrillion. And the difference there is that a lot of the weaker international currencies will have collapsed into the dollar. So the dollar will actually have grown in purchasing power overall. And I think by this time, so going into 2031, let's say, that Bitcoin will have continued its growth trajectory. It will have played out another one of these price cycles. Possibly its price cycle will have broken and it just gone into a long, slow grind upwards as people realize it's a game of accumulation. And I think Bitcoin by this time will have reached about 20% of global purchasing power. So this would imply Bitcoin's market cap in 2031 dollars to be about $250 trillion. So that's about 1/5 of global M2 stored in Bitcoin. Now, accounting for inflation, that means Bitcoin's market cap in today's dollars would be about 20 trillion. So in 2031 dollars, and this is a very bright line to distinguish, I think Bitcoin by the year 2031 will be north of $12.5 million per Bitcoin.
Jesus.
But
$12.5 million per coin?
12.5 million, but adjusting for inflation, it will only feel like north of $1 million per Bitcoin in 2021 dollars, because the dollar will have lost so much of its value by then. $12.5 million will spend like $1 million. So that's my prediction for by 2031. And then that's going to clearly have some big impact on fiat currencies, including the dollar.
Well, again, that goes back to Gresham's law, is that the more fake money what you're talking about is when they increase M2 and M3 and all of those stuff they taught me in economics, which I forgot. It's just printing more money. That's all they're doing.
Right.
And so that's what gives Bitcoin and the blockchain technology so much more credibility than the central bank money. Fake money, I call it.
That's right.